has dominion over a man as long as he lives. He's talking about the Jewish members who understood this, and I guess even those who were Romans who would have understood the law of the Romans. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So if then while her husband lives she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law, so that she is not an adulteress, although she's married another man. Now, you would expect the argument to take an entirely different direction than it does right here, but look at verse 4. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to that by which we were held, so that we should serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter. Now, what's Paul talking about? Well, everything that he says in these first 6 verses are based in a legal maxim. And that legal maxim is that death cancels all contracts. If you made a contract and you died, you can't keep that contract. The contract is canceled once you die. And he begins to illustrate this truth and wishes to use a picture as a symbol of what happens to a Christian. So he says, when a woman is married, if her husband is alive, she can't marry somebody else. If she does, then she's an adulteress. But if her husband dies, the contract is canceled. That's the concept here. That at death, the contract of marriage is canceled, and she's free to marry anyone that she likes. Now, Paul could have said this, and it's kind of what you expect him to say, one of two things. You expect him to say either we were married to sin and sin was slain by Christ, and therefore the contract we had with sin is canceled, and now we're free to be married to God. But he doesn't say that. Or he could have said, and what you would more likely in context expect him to say is, that we were married to the law, and the law was killed by the work of Christ, therefore we're now free to be married to God. But he doesn't say that, and that would be what you would expect. But he puts it in another way, and in his picture, here's what he says. We were the wife, we were married to the law, and we died. Therefore, we are now free to be married to another. That's kind of an amazing statement, isn't it? It seems like it throws off. If you're a wife and you're married to a husband and he dies, he's now free to be married to somebody else. The analogy doesn't quite hold up here, but Paul uses this analogy for a reason. Do you remember back in chapter 6 when he said, do you not know that as many of us as have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? We were buried with him, therefore, by baptism, and then he says, and raised to walk in newness of life. This is what he says in verses 3 and 4 of Romans chapter 6. He says, we are alive, but we died. At the point that we died when we were baptized, we were made free from the law. But now we're alive again, therefore we're free to be married to somebody else. I find that to be a significant and amazing argument. But I would say this, guys, if you are on the operating table and your heart stops beating, it doesn't mean that if they revive you, you're free to marry somebody besides your wife, okay? You're not. I just want you to know that. You're not. But that would be kind of the argument that's being used here, except that in this case, the person has died, really died, when he was baptized into Jesus Christ. And now he's become free. So now we marry, but we don't marry the law, we marry Christ now. And when that happens, Christian obedience becomes a behavior that is not externally imposed by certain written laws, but it's an allegiance of our heart and spirit to Christ. I think that you know when you're in a marriage that it's kind of good sometimes to have a division of labor. I think you kind of get that. I'm reminded of of a situation that a counselor told me about, that a young couple got married, and the morning after their honeymoon, when they got home on that first morning, he's laying in bed thinking, any minute now, she's going to get up and cook me a breakfast like my mama always did for my dad. And I am going to lay here and pretend to be asleep until she gets up and cooks that breakfast. What he doesn't know is that she's laying there pretending to be asleep, thinking, any minute now, he's going to get up and fix breakfast like my dad always did for my mom. And they're waiting for the other one, and finally both of them just look up at each other and say, when are you fixing breakfast? And he says, I thought you were doing that. And she says, I thought you were going to do that. And so they decide on a system of rules that, okay, one of us is going to fix breakfast most mornings, okay? And so this is one of the rules they decide on. A little bit later, about a month later, in fact, the garbage is against the kitchen door and piled almost as high as the kitchen door. And he comes in one day and he tells his wife, you know, for the last 4 weeks, that garbage has not been taken out and it's beginning to smell bad and it's as high as the kitchen door. And she says, in my family, my dad always took out the garbage. That's your job. Well, they get these rules, okay? And that's not so bad. It's who's going to drive the kids to school? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to be in the PTA? Who's going to, you name it. We kind of have a set of rules, but you and I know that if your marriage is just a set of rules, it's not a very satisfying marriage. In fact, it's not a really great marriage if it's all about the rules. But it's not all about the rules. It's about the love you have for the person. And because you love that person, it's not the rule that makes you want to do things. It's the love that you have. And what he's telling you is that there was a time that we were in love with the rules. Now we're in love with Christ. And so we behave not because of a rule primarily, but because of what Christ is to us. And that's the way that we do it. And these are the kind of contrast between the two states of man, the person without Christ and the person that's with Christ. Before we knew Christ, here's what we tried to do. We tried to rule life by obedience to a written law. That's what we tried to do. That's when we were in the flesh. And when Paul uses the term flesh, he doesn't just mean, in this case, the physical body, but he means the tendency of us in the flesh, the tendency of us in this body to follow a different set of rules than the rules that we know. That there's something there in us. There's something in us that answers to the seduction of sin. And that's the part of man that provides kind of a fortress for sin that Paul calls the flesh. The flesh that he's talking about here primarily is human nature apart from and unaided by God. When our human nature is unaided by God, the law actually moves us to sin. That's an incredible statement, that the law, he says, actually moved us to sin. Listen to what he said again. For when we were in the flesh, I'm going back to verse 5. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law. Notice, our sinful passions were aroused not by the seduction of sin, but the law. He says the law aroused our passion to sin. This is really strange, but you got to get it in order to understand what he's talking about. Aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to that which we were held by, so that we should serve in newness of the Spirit and not oldness of the letter. He says that the law actually helped to produce sin in our life. And that's a remarkable statement. Why is that? Well, maybe in part because the very fact that a thing is forbidden makes us kind of want it. It's sort of like me telling you not to think about the color purple right now. Just don't think about it. It's a terrible thing to think about purple. Don't think about purple. And you can't help it. You start thinking about purple. God says to Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And all of a sudden, Satan takes that and says, oh, but you got to. You have to. And it became this thing that was very difficult for them to overcome. When we had nothing but law, Paul is saying we were really at the mercy of sin, not because the law is bad, and we'll talk about that in just a minute as Paul goes on. And then he talks about the state of man that's ruled with Christ, who's in union with Christ. And we rule our spirit because Christ does, not so much by a written code of law, but by the allegiance to Jesus Christ, that I love him. And he's in my heart, he's in my spirit, and it's love that's now the motive of our life. And the inspiration of love can make you do what law wouldn't make you do. And we'll talk about it as he goes on. Look at verses 7 through 13 as he continues this thought. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. So in other words, no, the law's not sin. In fact, it points out sin. I understand what sin is because of the law. And I wouldn't have known anything about covetousness, that it's wrong, except the law said don't do it. But sin, this is verse 8, but sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without law. But when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me. I want you to remember that phrase, deceived me. We're going to come back to it in a minute. Sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin was producing death in me through what is good. The law is good. Sin was producing death in me through the law, okay, through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. This is one of the greatest statements in the New Testament, and confusing, and also one of the most moving, because what Paul is giving us here is his spiritual autobiography, and it is heart-wrenching to see what he's going to say here and in the next passage. Paul deals with the paradox of the law, and it's torturous to him. By itself, the law is a good thing, a wonderful thing. It's a holy thing. It's the very voice of God. The root meaning of the word holy, hagios in the Greek, it means different. It describes something that comes from a sphere different from this world. The law of God has come from heaven itself. And he says it can't be bad. It came from heaven itself. It's the very voice of God. It's just. If you've remembered us talking in the past about the Greek idea of justice, it means giving to God and to man their due. Therefore, the law is that which settles all relationships between man and God. If you perfectly kept the law, you would have a perfect relationship with God, and you would have, as far as you're concerned, a perfect relationship with man, if you kept the law. So the law is good. It's designed for nothing except our best and highest welfare. The law was designed for the best for us. It meant to make us good. And yet, for all of that, even though that's absolutely true, that same law is the very thing, he says, through which sin gains entry into a person. It's through the law that sin comes in. How does that happen? And he describes how that happens. There are two ways, I suppose, in which, in one sense, the law is the source of sin. Not that it's sinful, but it lets sin into our life. Here's the reason. Number one, because it defines sin. Paul says without law, there is no sin. Without law, sin doesn't have existence. Until a thing is defined by sin as the law, you can't even know that it's sin. Let me just make an analogy for a moment. I take my grandsons every once in a while to a tennis court. And it is an interesting thing when we play tennis together because we don't follow the rules. I can tell you that if there are 3 tennis courts side by side, we play all 3 at the same time. That ball can go anywhere. Beverly and I used to do exactly the same thing. I had to hit it on her side of the court within those lines, and she could hit it anywhere in the Christian world. I had to figure out a way to get it back. That was our rules, the way we played. And if I hit the ball over to the boys, if it bounces 5 times and then they hit it and it goes over the net, they feel like they've done really well, even though it may have bounced 5 times. Now, when I tell them the rules, the rule is that if it bounces more than once, it's a fault, okay? If it bounces more than once, it's a fault. And therefore, they're going to lose that game if they keep doing that. But until they knew what the rules were, bouncing it 5 times is a lot of fun. Once they know the rules, they know what the faults are. Am I making sense here? When it comes to that, that is the rules of tennis that define what's wrong with the way we're playing. And if we're following the rules, we have to play a different way. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm trying to make a little sense in the way that this would go. The rules define what is a fault is and what's allowable. And before they were made, before the rules were made, nothing was a fault. Now it is. So the law defines sin. Maybe here's another analogy. When children are young, okay, and we have this all the time. I remember sitting there's an etiquette that you're supposed to follow when you're on an airplane, okay? The etiquette is that you don't make too much noise, that you are not disruptive to other passengers on that plane. Children have no idea about that rule, okay? So when we were flying at one point when Jim was just a small child, Beverly and I both had been teaching in the Caribbean Christian College in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and we were on our way back to Miami. And as the plane took off and the pressure began to change, his ears began to hurt, and he began to scream, not just cry a little bit, but scream. And I mean scream, and continue to scream. And if you're a parent, it's the most helpless feeling in the world when you have a tiny little baby that's screaming and you can't get it to stop, and there is no cry room where you can take that baby in an airplane. Okay, you're just stuck there doing that. And so I gave him a bottle, and he took part of that bottle, and it wasn't enough, and I had run out of any kind of liquid to give him. I was not prepared. I was like those 5 foolish virgins. I should have thought about it. But I hadn't prepared anything else for him. So I asked the flight attendant, is there anything that I can put in this bottle to give my baby to help? And all she had was orange juice with pulp in it, okay? So I went ahead and I put it in, and I screwed that nipple back on, and I put it in, and he took one suck, and a piece of pulp got caught in the end of that, and he couldn't get anything to come out. And so I thought, oh, man, what am I going to do? So I took it off, I'm working, I get the pulp out, stick it back on, one suck, pulp back in, and he can't do it. I did this 3 times. I'm not having much success, so I thought, I've got to do this faster. So the next time the pulp got stuck, I really shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to. I put the bottle in my mouth and sucked as hard as I could to get the pulp out. And just at that time, the flight attendant came by, and my baby's crying, and I'm sucking on the bottle. There was no explaining that. Little kids don't understand that they're supposed to be quiet, okay? But a little kid, a little child, is given a pass. It's irritating for some folks, but generally they're given a pass. In fact, any adult that absolutely is not patient with a child in that moment needs to consider that they were once a child themselves. And so little children don't know the rules, and they don't know how that is, and so we don't expect them to obey rules they don't know. When the westward expansion began to happen in this country. And missionaries began to go into the Western territories, which, by the way, at the first was Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, as they were moving from the colonies westward. They ran into native populations whose morals were completely different. And it wasn't that they didn't have morality, they did. But their understanding of morality was completely different from Christianity. And so for some tribes, the only way to be considered a man was to go over and either steal from a neighboring tribe or to kill somebody in that tribe, and then you would be considered a man. And that was an honorable thing for them. It's not an honorable thing, but they didn't know the rules, okay? They didn't know that Christ has very clearly pointed out that you treat others as you yourself would like to be treated, that you love your neighbor as yourself, a concept totally foreign to them. And so you made exceptions because you know they didn't know what the rules were. They needed to understand what the teachings were before you could expect their behavior to change. We understood that. We understand it in little children. We understand it in cultures that haven't had the opportunity to learn. But we have a different kind of standard that we would have for a person who does know what's right and chooses not to do it. Then it becomes a rebellious thing. Then it becomes a more sinful thing. So the law creates sin in effect because it defines it. Now that I know that it's sin, if I go do it now, it's worse, okay? This is the point. Maybe one other illustration about this. Every city that Beverly and I have moved into, when we've moved from one place to another, has one-way streets. And in every single one of those cities, early on, I've driven the wrong way on a one-way street, not knowing that it's a one-way street, and then all of a sudden, everybody else is coming at me. And I'm thinking, these poor deluded people. But no, all of a sudden I realize I'm going the wrong way on a one-way street. Well, let's just assume that Trousdale out here, right now it's a two-way street. You can go both directions, north and south on it. But what if that next week they turn it into a one-way street and that it's only north? If you go south, you've broken the law. Okay? You might not have known that they changed it. But once you know that they've changed it and you go south, the penalty is pretty strong in that if you do that. So in one sense, a new regulation creates a new fault, that it wasn't a fault until the regulation came. So by making men aware of what it is, the law creates sin. That's one way in which the law helps to create sin. But I think there's a more serious sense in which the law produces sin. And this just has to do with our nature as human beings. And I mentioned it before, but I'm going to say it again. I think it's one of the strange facts of life that when something is forbidden, it's hard to resist. Have you ever noticed that in church, if something happens in church in a place where you shouldn't laugh, the desire to laugh becomes so strong you can hardly stand it? Have you noticed that? You're not supposed to do it. But in church, it gets funny. If it was outside of the church assembly, it wouldn't even be funny. But here it is, and it's funny. I once told everybody as we were getting ready to take the Lord's Supper, I want you to put everything out of your mind except the Lord's Supper. And about that time, a little 6-year-old boy lost his balance as he's standing on the edge of a pew and hit his head right on the edge of the pew, and it sounded like a gunshot. Now, normally, you would say, that poor child. But about 3 seconds went by and everybody laughed because they were supposed to be thinking about something else. And they realized none of us are thinking about that. And they all laughed. Sometimes things strike you as funny in church. I actually had to respond one time. I shouldn't even tell you this, but when I was a teenager, there was a visiting song leader and who was coming, and a visiting speaker who was coming on that Sunday morning. And the song leader at the invitation song began the invitation song that he announced, but he began with the wrong tune. And all of us were kind of singing along with him because the tune appeared to be working until we got to the chorus, and the tune wouldn't work at all, and it just fell apart. And rather than recognizing his error, the song leader stopped and chastised us all for about 2 minutes for not following him and started the song again on the same wrong tune. And he got to the same spot in the chorus, and it wouldn't go any further, and he thought it was all our fault. And so he really got on to us again, and then he started the song the third time, same wrong tune. Well, I couldn't help it. I was laughing. I couldn't quit laughing, and so I just ducked my head to try to keep low below the pew so that nobody would see that I was laughing. But the regular song leader for the congregation, who was one of our deacons and a great friend of our family, as soon as services were over, came to me and said, I can't believe you were laughing in church. I can't believe that you were doing that. He said, you need to come forward. You were a terrible example to everybody else in the church. And I felt awful, and I said, you're right. And so that night, at the invitation, I came forward. And when one of the elders came and asked me what it was, I told him, well, during the invitation song this morning, I got tickled, and I just couldn't quit laughing, and I was a disruption, and I just need people to forgive me. And he got up, and he made that announcement, and 6 people walked forward to respond. I'll never forget that. It was just funny. Some things are just funny. When they're not supposed to be, sometimes they are. Adam and Eve, listen, they were seduced. That's what happened. Now, Philo, who is a philosopher, Christian philosopher, allegorized that story. He said the serpent was pleasure, Eve stood for the senses. Pleasure, as it always does, wanting the forbidden thing, it attacked him through the senses. Now, Adam was reason, and through the attack of the forbidden thing on the senses, reason was led astray, and death came. That was what he said. Now, here's Augustine. Some of you have read Augustine, especially if you read Confessions, which I hope that you read some of the ancient literature, and particularly ancient Christian literature. But he wrote about this desire or fascination with the forbidden thing. He said, there was a pear tree near our vineyard laden with fruit. One stormy night, we rascally youths set out to rob it and carry our spoils away. We took off a huge load of pears, not to feast on ourselves, but to throw them to the pigs, though we ate just enough to have the pleasure of the forbidden fruit. They were nice pears, but it wasn't the pears that my wretched soul coveted, for I had plenty better at home. I picked them simply in order to become a thief. The only feast I got was a feast of iniquity, and I enjoyed it to the full. What was it that I loved in that theft? Was it the pleasure of acting against the law in order that I, a prisoner under rules, might have a maimed counterfeit of freedom by doing what was forbidden with a dim similitude of impotence? The desire to steal was awakened simply by the prohibition of stealing. There is something in us that wants the forbidden thing, and in that, he says, the law produces sin. Remember I said we're going to come back to that phrase, sin deceived me? The word that he uses there is exipatao in the Greek, and it means to seduce wholly. He said the law completely seduced me. That's the word that he's using here. There's always a deception of sin. Sin deludes us in at least 3 ways. We're deluded with regard to the satisfaction to be found in it. No one ever took a forbidden thing. No one ever did a forbidden thing that without thinking that somehow he would find pleasure in it. Somehow it would make him happy, and nobody ever found happiness in the process, in the end, for having done it. They're deluded. We're deluded regarding the excuse that we think can be made for it. Every person who's doing wrong can make a great excuse for doing wrong. And not one of those excuses will stand up in the presence of God in the day of judgment. Not one. We delude ourselves when we think that. And I think we're deluded concerning the probability of escaping the consequences of sin. That yes, that's a bad thing, but it's probably not going to happen to me. I think I'll get away with it. But the truth is that either in this life or in the next, sin will always come out. In this life or in the next, my sin will find me out. So is the law a bad thing that it actually produces sin? And Paul says, no, that's not true. He says there's a whole wisdom of sequence here that he points out. And I haven't even gotten to the last part. I'm going to have to move on in just a second. But he says he's convinced that whatever the consequence, sin had to be defined as sin. We have to know what's wrong. We have to know. And so the law had to give us that thing. And the process is the horrible nature of sin that can take something holy and just and good and twist it into something that serves the ends of evil. And that's what sin does, okay? That's what sin does. It takes the wonderful nature of love and it twists it into lust. It can take that honorable desire for independence in life and twist it into a love of money and power. It can take the beauty of friendship and turn it into seduction to do the wrong thing. I think it was someone in this room that said that if you have one teenage boy, he has average intelligence. If you have two, they have half that intelligence. And if you have three, God help us all. The fact of the matter is sometimes our friendships lead us into the wrong direction. Satan took the law and turned it into a place where sin develops. And it tells us something about how horrible sin is. But let me move on because our time is almost up. Look at verses 14 through 25. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will or want to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I do not will to do, I agree with the law that it's good. But now it's no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For the will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I want to do, I do not do. But the evil that I do not want to do, that's what I practice. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it's no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to my inward man, but I see another law at work in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. Oh man, he's bearing his soul and actually uncovering ours in the process. He knew what was right and he wanted to do it, but somehow he never could. He knew what was wrong, and it's the last thing that he wanted to do, and yet somehow he did it. He felt himself to be somehow a split personality, as if there were two people living inside of him, pulling in different directions. He could see what was good, but he wasn't able to do it. He could recognize what was wrong, but he was unable to refrain from doing it. That's where he is. Seneca called it our helplessness in necessary things. I wish I had more time to look at the Jewish writings about this, but I'm not going to for a second. And maybe we can just go a little further, and maybe this will help. Theoretically, the Jewish people said, and I'm just going to tell you this, Jewish rabbis said that the law was the antiseptic for evil, that I find evil, but if I dedicate myself to the law, that I can do good. That inside of us there is reason, there is emotion, and there is law. And that if I use my reason and the law, that I can make a choice between what is wrong and what is right, and I can always choose to do what is right. And Paul is able to say that is theoretically true. It is true. We're responsible for our own sins. All of us have made choices and therefore we have sinned. But in practical reality, it's not true because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's Romans 3:23. We're never as good as we know we ought to be. At one and the same time, we're haunted by goodness and we're haunted by sin. The passage is a demonstration of our inadequacies. It demonstrates the inadequacy of human knowledge. Knowing the right thing is a good thing. If knowing the right thing made us do it, then life would be easy. I graduated from Freed-Hardeman, and I was convinced when I came out to preach that the problem that humans faced is that they didn't have enough information. If you give them enough information about what God has said and they understand what God has said, then they'll behave like God wants them to behave, and life will be good. It took very little time before I realized that a lot of people knew what they ought to do, even in the church, but they weren't doing it. It's not enough just to know what's right. That doesn't by itself make you do what's right. You can illustrate that in all kinds of ways. You may know how the game of golf ought to be played. That doesn't mean you can play it. You may know the rules of poetry and how they ought to be followed, but it certainly doesn't make you a poet to be able to know that. To know how we ought to behave in any given situation does not mean we will behave that way. We don't. We often do not. That's the difference between true religion and morality, okay? Morality is a knowledge of a code, but true religion is knowledge of a person in Jesus Christ. There's the inadequacy of human knowledge. There's the inadequacy of human resolution. Our wills are weak, and we know what's right, but we often lack the will to do it. We fail often. Peter said, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. Matthew 26:35. What's he doing a short time later? Denying him 3 times. There's the problem of the inadequacy of the human will. And then there is the problem of the inadequacy of diagnosis. Paul clearly knew what was wrong, but he couldn't put it right. He's like a doctor who can diagnose a disease but has no idea how to cure it. That's where Paul is as he's talking about his own life. Now, the answer to this dilemma, and I want you to think about what Paul says. Wretched man that I am. Too often, we have just enough Christianity to be miserable when we're doing wrong, but we want to do wrong when we're doing right. That's where we are. It's part of the human condition. How do we get past that? How do we come to a place where we are content in our skin with where we are in terms of our righteousness? How do we ever come to terms with our weakness and the demands of God? And that's what chapter 8 is all about. So next week, you're going to find the answer. This week, he pointed out the problem. Every once in a while, I have people say, when Paul is writing what he's writing, is he writing about himself before he was a Christian, or is he writing about himself now? And the answer to that is yes, he is. Because being a Christian, don't you still struggle with this same concept? Don't you still struggle with, I know what's right, but I'm not always doing it? And the more I know about what's right, the more I realize how far short I fall. It's the reason why at their deathbed, people tell me I'm not sure I've been good enough to go to heaven. Why? Because that struggle continues as long as you're alive. How do you resolve it? Don't wait till your deathbed to do it. You can resolve that now. So read Romans 8, and then we'll talk about it next week. Let's have a prayer. Father, we thank you so much for loving us. We thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunities of it. We thank you that you've shown us the way that we ought to live, and we ask that we might have such a relationship with Christ that we'll want to live that way. Help us in the midst of all of our weakness. Help us in the midst of all of our failures to trust that you are a good and gracious God, and that you know what's best for us, and that you will bring what's best to us if we simply don't let go of you. Thank you for being our God. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys.